The courtroom was silent, thick with tension. The wooden benches creaked as people shifted uncomfortably, waiting for the verdict. At the center of it all stood Marcus Carter, a hard-working black man in his late 30s, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His suit, though neatly pressed, did little to hide the exhaustion in his eyes. He had done nothing wrong. He knew it. His lawyer knew it. The entire room knew it. But Judge Raymond Caldwell, a man infamous for his harsh and racially biased rulings, was about to make his decision. And Marcus had a sinking feeling that justice had already been bought and sold long before he even stepped foot in this courtroom. Judge Caldwell tapped his gavel against the polished oak desk, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow smirk creeping onto his face, he leaned forward. "Marcus Carter, this court finds you guilty of all charges," his voice rang out, casual, almost bored. "You are hereby ordered to pay a fine of $75,000. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even some of the spectators who had seen this judge hand out questionable rulings before seemed stunned at the sheer cruelty of the punishment. $75,000? For what? Marcus felt his breath hitch. His attorney, David Lawson, shot up from his seat, his voice firm but controlled. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this fine is outrageous. My client has no prior record. No substantial evidence was presented against him, and—" Judge Caldwell slammed his gavel down, hard. The sharp crack echoed through the room. "Sit down, counselor," he snapped, his voice dripping with authority. "I've made my ruling." Marcus turned to David, panic creeping into his voice. "We have to appeal this. There has to be a way." David sighed, his jaw tight. "We will, but it won't be easy." Judge Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening as he watched Marcus struggle to comprehend what had just happened. There was something sickeningly gleeful in his eyes, like a predator toying with its prey. "If you can't afford the fine, Mr. Carter," he said, voice laced with mock sympathy, "well, maybe you should have thought about that before breaking the law." Marcus hadn't broken any law. Everyone in that room knew it. But knowing the truth and proving it in a courtroom run by a corrupt man were two very different things. He felt the weight of the verdict settle over him like a coffin lid. He had a family to take care of, bills to pay, and now a debt so crippling it might ruin his entire life. The judge gave one final dismissive nod. "Court is adjourned." The gavel struck. Marcus Carter's world shattered. Marcus Carter had spent his entire life playing by the rules. Born and raised in South Carolina, he had worked tirelessly to build a life for his family. A father of two, a loving husband, and a man who believed in hard work and integrity, Marcus had never thought he'd find himself standing in a courtroom fighting for his basic rights. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a troublemaker. He was just a man trying to survive in a world that had never been fair to him. For the past 10 years, Marcus had been running a small auto repair shop, a business he had built from the ground up. Long nights, early mornings, and endless sacrifices had finally paid off. His shop was doing well enough to provide for his wife Danielle and their 2 kids, Malcolm, 12, and Ava, 8. But in a town where people like him were expected to stay in their place, success came with consequences. And Judge Raymond Caldwell had made it his personal mission to remind Marcus of that. Raymond Caldwell was more than just a judge. He was a king in his own court. A man in his late 50s with slicked-back gray hair and piercing blue eyes, he had spent the last 20 years wielding his power like a weapon. To the outside world, he was a respected legal figure, known for being tough on crime. But the people in this town, especially the black community, knew the truth. Caldwell wasn't just tough on crime, he was tough on people who looked like Marcus. He had a reputation for handing out excessive sentences, crushing fines, and unfair rulings, always against black defendants. And the worst part? No one could touch him. His friends were in high places, police chiefs, prosecutors, politicians. Even when someone dared to challenge his rulings, the system always protected him. For years, people had whispered about the bribes, the backroom deals, the fabricated evidence that seemed to follow his most controversial cases. But whispers weren't enough to bring down a man like Caldwell. He was untouchable. Marcus still couldn't believe what had just happened. $75,000. For what? A minor business violation that wasn't even his fault? He had been accused of operating his auto shop without the proper paperwork, a claim that was completely false. His permits were all in order. He had spent weeks gathering every document, every proof of legality. But none of it mattered. Judge Caldwell hadn't even looked at the evidence. He had already made up his mind before the trial had even begun. Marcus had seen that look before, the one that white men like Caldwell gave black men like him. That look that said, "You don't matter." It wasn't about the law. It wasn't about justice. It was about power. And Judge Caldwell had all of it. The moment Marcus stepped into his courtroom, he had already lost. Marcus sat in his truck outside the courthouse, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. $75,000. It didn't feel real. His entire life savings didn't even come close to that number. His business, his home, his family, everything was now on the line. The weight of it all pressed down on him, suffocating. He thought about Danielle. How was he supposed to tell his wife that they were about to lose everything? How was he supposed to look into the eyes of his kids and explain why they might not have a home soon? Marcus had spent his life believing in hard work. He had always told himself, if I do the right thing, life will be fair to me. But standing here, staring at the courthouse that had just ripped his life apart, he realized something sickening. It didn't matter how hard he worked, because men like Judge Caldwell had already decided his fate. He had hoped, prayed, that the community would stand by him, that people would see this for what it was, a corrupt judge ruining an innocent man's life. But the moment he stepped out onto the street, he saw the way people looked at him. Whispers, judgment, avoidance. Some shook their heads, muttering under their breath. Others exchanged glances, their expressions saying exactly what they thought. He must have done something to deserve this. No one came forward. No one offered help. Even people he had known for years, customers, neighbors, so-called friends, all kept their distance, because standing up for Marcus meant standing up against power. And nobody wanted to cross Judge Caldwell. Marcus had one last hope, his lawyer, Brent Hastings. Hastings had assured him before the trial, "We got this, the evidence is on our side." But the moment the fine was announced, his lawyer's entire demeanor had changed. Now, as Marcus walked into Hastings's office, he could feel it in his gut. Something wasn't right. Hastings barely even looked up from his desk. "Look, Marcus, I did everything I could," he said, his tone flat, "but this case was never in our favor." Marcus's chest tightened. "Never in our favor? You told me we had proof, that we—" Hastings sighed and leaned back in his chair. "It's out of my hands now." That's when Marcus saw it. The guilt, a flash of guilt in Hastings's eyes. And in that moment, he knew. "You made a deal with him, didn't you?" Marcus whispered. Hastings didn't deny it. Didn't even look ashamed. The judge. Let's just say he made it clear that pushing this case any further wouldn't be in my best interest. Marcus felt his stomach turn. "You sold me out," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You let that man destroy my life, and I did what I had to do." Hastings' voice was cold. "And if you're smart, you'll drop this and move on." Move on! Like it was that easy. Like his life hadn't just been ripped apart by a system that was never meant to protect him. Marcus stared at the man who was supposed to fight for him and saw nothing but a coward. He turned and walked out of the office, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage, helplessness, and something else. Something dangerous. If no one was going to stand up for him, he'd stand up for himself. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. His wife, Danielle, placed a cup of coffee in front of him, but he barely noticed. His mind was somewhere else, running in circles, searching for a way out. Appeal. That was his only option. He had spent the last 3 days calling every lawyer he could find. The response was always the same. "I'm sorry, but I can't take this case." Or worse, they didn't even return his calls. Danielle placed a gentle hand on his. "Baby, you've been up all night. Maybe we should—" "I can't stop, Danny," he whispered. "If I don't fix this, we lose everything." His wife's eyes welled up with tears. "But what if there's nothing to fix? What if this is just how things are?" Marcus swallowed hard. That's what they wanted. To break him. To make him believe there was no way out. But he refused to accept that. Even if the system was corrupt, even if the deck was stacked against him, he had to fight. Because if he didn't, who would? It was the 4th lawyer's office he had visited that day. And like all the others, the response was the same. "Judge Caldwell is powerful. No one in this town will go against him." Marcus stormed out of the office, frustration boiling inside him. He had barely made it down the courthouse steps when he heard a voice behind him. "You're wasting your time, you know." He turned to see a man leaning against a car, arms crossed. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with tired eyes and a knowing smirk. "Excuse me," Marcus asked, narrowing his eyes. The man shrugged. "You're trying to take down a judge in his own kingdom. No lawyer in this town will touch your case." Marcus clenched his fists. "And who the hell are you?" The man smirked and extended a hand. "Name's Frank Delaney. Used to be a lawyer. Now I just piss off the right people." Marcus hesitated, then shook his hand. "I read about your case," Frank continued. "Judge Caldwell's been pulling this kind of crap for years, but nobody's ever had the guts to fight back." Marcus scoffed. "And what good did that do? I can't find a single lawyer who's willing to help me." Frank studied him for a moment, then said, "Maybe you don't need a lawyer. Maybe you need something stronger." Marcus frowned. "Like what?" Frank's smile widened. "The truth." Marcus followed Frank to a dusty old diner on the edge of town. The place smelled like stale coffee and fried food. In the corner, an old radio played jazz music, the static making it barely recognizable. Frank slid a folder across the table. "I spent years in that courthouse," he said, "and I saw plenty of cases like yours. Black men and women slapped with impossible fines, families losing their homes, businesses ruined." Marcus opened the folder and saw names, dates, and case numbers. All of these were Judge Caldwell's rulings. Frank nodded. The same pattern, over and over again. And if you dig deep enough, you'll find out why. Marcus flipped through the pages. Some of the cases were decades old. Some of these people had lost everything. "I don't get it," Marcus muttered. "What does he gain from this?" Frank leaned forward. "It's not about money, it's about control. He's been doing this for years, using the legal system to crush people who can't fight back. And the worst part? Nobody ever questions him." Marcus clenched his jaw. "Well, that's about to change." Frank grinned. "Now you're starting to sound like a man who wants to win." Marcus looked at the stack of files in front of him. For the first time since the trial, hope flickered in his chest. If they could find something, anything, that proved Judge Caldwell's corruption, they could take him down. Judge Caldwell sat in his grand office, his fingers drumming against his desk. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the report in front of him. "Marcus Williams is digging." The thought made his blood boil. He had seen this before, a desperate man trying to fight a battle he had already lost. But Marcus wasn't like the others. Most men broke the moment he handed down his ruling. They swallowed their pride, paid their fines, and disappeared into the shadows. But Marcus, he was still fighting. And worse, he wasn't alone. Caldwell set the report down and picked up his phone. "Antucci." The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Yes, Judge?" Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a smirk. "Williams is getting too bold. Time to remind him who runs this town." The man on the other end chuckled darkly. "Consider it done." Marcus sat on the couch, flipping through pages of court records, when a loud knock made him jump. Danielle walked in from the kitchen, concern on her face. Who could that be this late? Marcus set the files aside and walked to the door. As soon as he opened it, his stomach dropped. Two uniformed officers stood on his porch. "Marcus Williams?" one of them asked, his voice cold and professional. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Not again. "We have a warrant for your arrest." Danielle gasped behind him. "No, you can't." One of the officers yanked Marcus forward, twisting his arms behind his back. The sharp bite of the handcuffs made him wince. "You're being charged with obstruction of justice and falsifying evidence," the officer continued. Marcus felt like he had been punched in the gut. "What? That's a lie." The officers didn't care. They dragged him down the steps as Danielle's voice cracked with panic. "Marcus, what's happening?" Marcus struggled, but he knew there was no use. Judge Caldwell had made his move, and he had just lost his freedom. Jail was worse than Marcus remembered. The cold walls, the stench of sweat and regret. The feeling of helplessness. He sat on the hard bench, his head in his hands. Judge Caldwell wasn't just trying to ruin his life, he was trying to erase him. Danielle couldn't afford bail. Frank was doing everything he could, but the court system was controlled by Caldwell's people. There was no way out. Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. Maybe Danielle was right. Maybe this was just how things were. Maybe he should have walked away. But then, the guard came to his cell. "You got a visitor." Marcus frowned. "Frank?" The guard shook his head. "No. Says he has information on Caldwell." Marcus's heart pounded. "Who?" He followed the guard down the long hallway to the visitor's room. A hooded figure sat behind the glass, their face hidden. Marcus picked up the phone. "Who are you?" The man hesitated, then pulled his hood back. And Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the face. A former courtroom clerk. Someone who had worked under Caldwell for years. Someone who had suddenly disappeared. Marcus leaned in. "Why are you here?" The man swallowed hard. "Because I know Caldwell's biggest secret." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Every seat was filled. Reporters clutched their notepads, cameras flashed, and the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Judge Caldwell sat at the bench, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. He shifted uncomfortably as federal prosecutor Richard Lawson stood in front of the jury, his voice echoing through the room. Ladies and gentlemen, today we expose not just one man's corruption, but a system designed to oppress, silence, and destroy lives." The jury sat still, their eyes locked on him. For years, Judge Caldwell has abused his power, falsified charges, and taken bribes to send innocent men, especially black men, to financial ruin or prison. But today, Lawson turned, gesturing toward Marcus Williams. One man stood up, and because of him, the truth is finally coming out. Marcus sat at the witness stand, his hands gripping the edge of the table. This was it. Lawson paced slowly. Then he dropped the bombshell. "Your Honor, let's talk about Case Hash, 2016-347, The disappearance of Jacob Porter. The room went silent. Caldwell's face twitched. But Lawson wasn't done. Jacob Porter worked in Judge Caldwell's courtroom. He was a clerk who started noticing strange financial activity, fines that didn't add up, cases being manipulated. He was gathering evidence. Lawson turned sharply. Until he vanished. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Caldwell shifted in his seat, his fingers curling into fists. No body was ever found, Lawson continued, his voice sharper now. But witnesses saw Judge Caldwell arguing with Porter the night before he disappeared. Caldwell finally spoke. "This is outrageous." "Sit down, Your Honor," Lawson snapped, his voice like a whip. Caldwell froze. Because for the first time he wasn't the one giving orders. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A hush fell over the room. A man stepped inside. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed. But there was no mistaking it. Jacob Porter was alive. The courtroom erupted. Caldwell shot to his feet, his face pale. This is a setup." Jacob walked forward, gripping the edge of the witness stand. His voice trembled, but held steady. "I worked for Judge Caldwell for years. I saw everything, the false cases, the bribes, the threats. When I tried to expose it, I was told to disappear." His haunted eyes met the jury. "So I did, for 8 years, but I can't stay silent anymore." Judge Caldwell snapped. "You have no proof. This is a circus. Lies, all lies." He slammed his fist on the bench. But he had already lost. Lawson smiled coldly. "We have bank records, witnesses, testimonies, and now we have Jacob Porter." The judge's breath came in short gasps. His hands trembled. Then the courtroom doors burst open. FBI agents stormed in. "Richard Caldwell, you are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice." Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. His face collapsed. He turned toward Marcus, pure venom in his eyes. "You think you won?" His voice was low, dangerous. Marcus met his gaze, his voice calm. "No, justice won." As Caldwell was dragged away, screaming, the crowd exploded into cheers. Marcus closed his eyes, breathing deeply. For the first time in years, he was free. Marcus stood outside the courthouse, the evening sun casting long shadows over the stone steps. The crowd behind him was still buzzing, reporters shouting questions, people cheering. But for Marcus, the noise had faded into the background. He stared at the police van parked near the curb. Inside, Judge Richard Caldwell sat in handcuffs, staring back at him. For years, this man had controlled lives, ruined families, and walked away without consequences. Now, for the first time, he had nowhere to run. Their eyes met. Caldwell's lips curled into a sneer. "You think this changes anything?" He spat through the small window of the van. "People like me don't fall. You took me down, but the system, it still belongs to men like me." Marcus didn't blink. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Caldwell could hear. "Not anymore." The doors slammed shut. The van rumbled to life and pulled away, taking the disgraced judge toward the fate he had condemned so many innocent people to. The world had finally seen him for what he was. As Marcus watched the van disappear into the city, a familiar voice spoke behind him. "You did it." He turned to see Jacob Porter, the man who had been forced into hiding, the man whose return had sealed Caldwell's fate. But Jacob's face was still tight with worry, his hands clenched at his sides. "We exposed one man," he said quietly, "but how many more are still out there?" Marcus exhaled, his chest heavy. Caldwell wasn't the only corrupt judge. This case had revealed just how deep the rot went. The bribes, the wrongful convictions, the power games played at the expense of innocent lives. And the system? It wasn't built to punish its own. "This isn't over, Marcus," Jacob said. They'll come for us. You know that, right? Marcus looked around. Reporters were already turning to the next big headline. Justice had won today. But tomorrow the fight might start all over again. Marcus felt the weight of everything, the years of injustice, the pain, the battle he never asked for. But he wasn't broken. Not anymore. He turned to Jacob, his voice steady. Then let them come. The screen fades to black. A final message appears. One man stood against corruption and won, but how many others are still fighting?